studied your dual sensitivity essay many times, and something you say there is that you must do sadhana on the basis of the acknowledgement of your profound fear of death and the acknowledgement of fear altogether. And I feel I've understood more about fear altogether in recent years. But I don't altogether, I'm not really sensitive altogether to specifically the fear of death.
If you're not afraid of death yet, don't be concerned. You will be.
Well, beloved, the question arose because reading this essay many times I was simply struck by the fact that I seem to be more aware of other kinds of fear. And
other kinds of fear, what kind?
Just a kind of generalized fear or physical threat being in the city.
This doesn't seem to have some relationship to fear of death, do you?
Just seemed to me there would be...
Doesn't it?
Yes, well, yes.
I mean, anxious in the city. Anxious about what? Difficult, terrible things that can happen?
Yes. Yes.
Well, what difference would it make if you weren't afraid of death?
So all those forms of fear are kind of extensions of the fear of death.
What do you say? Extensions? Or are?
So in some sense all fear is fear of death?
What do you say? What is the content of it as fear? What is it threatening?
Some kind of threat of extinction, yes. Yes. Yes.
Threat of extinction, yes. Loss of objects. Loss of the ability to experience. Loss of existence altogether. Such things are
Yes.
just words used to describe something very fundamental, but it certainly sounds like fear of death in some, simply stated.
Yes.
Wouldn't you say?
Yes, beloved. Yes, it makes perfect sense. Somehow I was kind of drawing a line saying it's not really death, something like that.
Well, not yet.
Right.
But all fear of death is about something that's not yet. Right. Otherwise, you'd already be dead. Until you are dead, you fear death.
Yes.
And then when you're already dead, it's already happened. Maybe then you're afraid of something else. But in any case, fear of death is always previous to death.
Yes, beloved.
You are afraid of death, then.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes, very clearly.
In fact, you're afraid of virtually everything.
That's That's true.
Omniphobia.
Summarizes it well. Omniphobic.
So, you do have some sensitivity then that you would describe as fear of death,
Yes.
fundamentally.
Yes.
And so, what about it? Is there a question then?
Well, I think you answered it, beloved. I think it was something about not wanting to connect all that other fear to death, or somehow trying to keep that at a distance. But it seems really clear from what you've said that it's all kind of extension of that. That's the ultimate fear of extinction, of, as you say, loss of objects, loss of all the life.
But there's something also more profound about it than that. Since it's not about your not being afraid of death, but in fact is fundamentally fear of death that you are describing in life. What is there to understand about it? What is it exactly? Because it's not a characteristic of death. Fear of death is a characteristic of life.
Yes, well.
You don't know what the characteristics of death are until you are not even merely dying, but actually dead. And then you'll know what that is, if you're capable of knowing it all.
Yes, well.
You're also afraid of that. Maybe you will not be capable of knowing anything at all. And all of this, of course, has something to do with your fundamental ignorance of your actual condition and the nature of reality. So you're identified with the body-mind, and this is one of the characteristic experiences. But why is it a characteristic experience associated with being alive? I mean, virtually anybody who could have come forward and asked me a question something like yours and wound up confessing that they are, in fact, aware of being afraid of death, and that it is rather generalized and covers their entire life in some sense, and is more or less a constant, like a constant background noise or background sensation or background emotion to virtually every moment of life, although you try to ignore it or become diverted from it. But fundamentally, you are afraid. And you don't particularly like it, it would seem.
No.
But you also haven't entered into the examination of it very profoundly, because until a couple of minutes ago, you didn't even acknowledge that you were afraid of death. Or couldn't identify fear in these terms. Fear is inherently associated with self-contraction. It is the native mood of self-contraction. It is the emotional mood of the ego. It is the primal emotion of egoity. It is not merely fear of death. It is identifiable in natural terms relative to natural events and to fears associated with the current grasping on to body-mind states and not wanting to lose them or the capability for them. So it even has a more profound context, remarkably enough, than death. It's the fundamental act of life showing itself emotionally. If that action is transcended, then fear is transcended. There is a condition prior to fear in which there is no fear. This must be realized, of course, but it is so. And if that condition is realized, then all of conditional existence is transcended. All of the implications of the body-mind are transcended. All of the fundamental ignorance associated with egoity and identification with conditional states is transcended. It's also not an attainment of the body-mind. It's not a state to be created or achieved as a result of some transformation of the body-mind itself. Although there is something about the egoic bondage to the body-mind, an act of the body-mind, that certainly must be transcended in order for this realization to become self-evident. Having entered into the domain of this inherently fearless condition, all inclination to be in some lesser state, conditioned by limitations and death, is displaced. And a profound process begins and goes on to the ultimate degree of its course. This is the perfect practice. The divine self-condition is in this position, always already. It must be realized, cannot be realized by acts of the body-mind. It's not a philosophical matter merely. There are certain kinds of noticings that can occur for a moment, but realization is not that. So it would seem that most perfect divine self-realization is a condition in which your worst fears will be perfectly and completely realized. You want nothing to do with realization. You seem to want everything to do with bondage, because you fear the implications of realization, of truth, of reality, not merely the implications of death. You fear the loss of egoity and the egoic position, even though it is precisely the condition in which death is guaranteed. And it is what, in fact, is going to die, and there is no two ways about it. It's not only going to die a little bit, it's going to die in every fraction, gross, subtle, and causal. All of it will go. There can be transformations of conditional state in the meantime, but ultimately, all of it goes. Just as in physical death, the gross part goes, well, there can be still processes, would still be inevitably processes of a subtle and causal nature, producing more modes of transformation and so forth, in the midst of which there'll be the same bewilderment, same self-contraction, same defensiveness, same protection of ignorance and of egoity itself, same failure to identify the suffering as such for real and to identify it as your own activity, and the same fundamental unwillingness, obstinacy, the conviction somehow or other arrived at, it somehow seems logical, that it is not desirable to realize reality. Truth, real God, not desirable because it requires loss of self. So you are not afraid of death, merely you are afraid of God. Not in any positive sense. You are afraid to surrender because surrender is the relinquishment of the very thing you are defending. So even fear of death is dishonest. It's a kind of misplacement of the reality of what fear is about. Most people spend their entire lives being carried by a fundamental anxiety, which sometimes becomes more of fear and sometimes becomes terror, you see, being terrified and so forth. This ride on the degrees of this fundamental underlying emotion, which they identify with the fear of death and what they think death implies or suggests, since they don't know exactly what goes on in it. But actually it is as if you were pinching yourself. You see, it's just another one of those symptoms. Like it's the emotion that most characterizes the fundamental symptom of egoity itself, of self-possession, of separateness. Separateness from what? Separateness into fear itself. Separation into fear itself. It's a reaction to the condition in which you're actually existing. Not merely a feeling of being threatened by what is yet to occur, but a refusal of that which is always already the case. A refusal of the condition that is actually the case now, in the apparent now. It is so now. but you think there's something about that you don't like. Something about it is to be avoided. You misidentify the divine reality and are thinking it is death. Whereas it's not itself literal, natural death, you see. But it is associated with the implications you fear in your self-contraction, your identification with the body-mind. The divine condition has no body-mind. So it seems to correspond in your tacit awareness of it. That is unconscious until realization, you see. You identify it as something negative. You're avoiding it by means of self-contraction. And now you are here. And that's why. Not here in this room, merely. Here, in this condition. In this state of imagination. In which you are bewildered, afraid, and asking questions. And trapped, as I say, between a rock and a hard place. You can't wholeheartedly embrace it, and you can't get out of it. So just to exist is to be trapped. And it's to feel fear, which you cover up with diversions, so that it's just a mumbling anxiety as much as, for as much waking time as you can possibly keep at that low grade level, you see. But it could be brought out in an instant. Just unfortunate conditions coming out of nowhere. And fear would overwhelm you physically. Beyond coping in the physical sense. Ultimate fear can't be coped with physically. It shatters the body, and so death would be inevitable. So death is going to happen anyway, and fear will be associated with it by tendency. So would you prefer to go on in this between the rock and the hard place kind of squeeze? Or does it make any sense to you to be surrendered to reality itself?
Yes, absolutely.
By realizing it, by responding to that one through tacit recognition. That's the recognition of me that makes devotion. Being carried by that, moved by that, instructed in it, until the effort of self-contraction is no longer unconscious and overwhelming and bewildering, and ultimately is perfectly transcended. What possible argument could there be against that?